governmental immunity, personal injuries, motor vehicles, even snowmobiles. How did all these things come together? Well, Tom Sinas from Sinas Famous Law Firm is going to tell us about a Michigan Supreme Court ruling that pertains to all these things. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Todd. How are you?
I'm well. I don't think we've ever spoken about governmental immunity before when it pertains to personal injury cases. Talk about that.
Yeah, it is a strange sounding concept, one that comes up more often, I think, than most people would think. So what is it? Well, governmental immunity is the idea that the government can generally not be sued when it is exercising its governmental function. Let me read you the language from the statute. It says this: a governmental agency is immune from tort liability if the governmental agency is engaged in the exercise or discharge of a governmental function. Tort liability, that phrase, is what most people think of as a personal injury case. It's the same concept. And so the statute in Michigan, which is true in other states, is the idea that if you are hurt and the person who inflicted the harm is an employee of the government or something of that sort, then the government may very well be immune, meaning that you cannot pursue a claim against them. Now, I should say it's not as simple as that. There are exceptions to governmental immunity. It isn't a blanket across the board immunity. We have a number of exceptions. For example, there's an exception if governmental employees are acting in a grossly negligent way, which is a much higher standard. We have exceptions for things like maintaining highways, public buildings, the list goes on. So there are limited exceptions, but they are exceptions to a general rule that governments are immune from civil lawsuits for personal injury cases.
Would one of those exceptions include motor vehicles? I mean, we're talking about injuries that maybe a government official was responsible for to someone else. Does that include when they're in their cars?
That's a great question. Yes, that is one of the exceptions. One of the exceptions to governmental immunity is as follows: governmental agencies shall be liable for bodily injury and property damage resulting from the negligent operation of any officer, agent, or employee of the governmental agency of a motor vehicle of which the governmental agency is an owner. Okay, that's a wordy way of saying that if the government owns the vehicle and it's being driven negligently by a governmental employee or agent, and someone is injured, the victim can pursue a personal injury claim against the government. It's an exception to immunity. And so it takes those kind of situations, what we call the motor vehicle exception, takes those motor vehicle exception cases and allows the victim to pursue a claim in a similar way that they would a general personal injury case, although there are unique rules that apply even to that claim. But the basic idea here is that motor vehicles are an exception to governmental immunity.
And then again, there was a recent decision from the Michigan Supreme Court. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay, so this is where it even gets more complicated. So this decision dealt with this vexing question that the courts have had to deal with over the years. What is a motor vehicle? Because the governmental immunity statute does not define specifically what a motor vehicle is. So over the course of the years, our appellate courts have had to look at situations obviously not involving your traditional car, in situations involving other types of vehicles, and ask themselves the question, is that vehicle a motor vehicle? Because if it is a motor vehicle, then, and if it's owned by the government and being negligently operated by a governmental employee, then the victim can pursue a claim through this exception to governmental immunity. But if it's not a motor vehicle, then the exception doesn't apply. So we've had cases over the years involving golf carts and forklifts and all kinds of things different than your traditional car. The case that you referred to, the decision of the Michigan Supreme Court, involved a snowmobile that was owned by the Department of Natural Resources, involved in a crash where people were hurt. And the question there was, well, is this snowmobile, is this a motor vehicle? Because again, if it is, then the exception to immunity applies. If it isn't, it doesn't. And this case went to the Court of Appeals which is our intermediate appellate court. And the Court of Appeals said, yes, the snowmobile is a motor vehicle. And what made the news recently was that the Michigan Supreme Court declined to review that decision of the Court of Appeals. What does that mean? It means that the Court of Appeals opinion stands. So we now have a rule that snowmobiles can be motor vehicles for purposes of the governmental immunity statute. Otherwise stated, if someone is the victim of an injury caused by a snowmobile owned by the government and negligently operated by a government employee, then that victim may be able to pursue a claim in tort liability. So there's a lot in there, right? But what we're seeing here is this layering of rules and concepts that apply whenever you have an injury case that involves a governmental agency or a governmental employee. The cases, as I think you can gather here, they're relatively complicated.
Wow, you aren't kidding. The minutia, the finer points of personal injury law. You guys know it all. It's Sinas Dramus Law Firm. How can people reach you?
They can find us online at www.sinasdramus.com. They can shoot us an email at info@sinasdramus.com or give us a call at 616-301-3333.
Thanks as always for the insight, Tom.
Thanks, Todd.